Inside a storage box at a Norwegian museum sits a clump of matted bear hair and 5 curved claws, dug out of a burial mound in 1889, and for over a century, they've been quietly dismantling one of the most famous warriors in human history. The screaming, foam-mouthed super soldier you're picturing right now, immune to pain, immune to iron, that version is wrong. What actually got buried across Norway and Sweden for 500 years is stranger than the legend and far harder to explain. And the industry built on that legend, the sagas turned tourism boards, the Hollywood scripts, the metal album covers, has zero incentive to tell you that. One archaeologist spent years trying to say it anyway. Roderick Dale went back to the actual Old Norse sources, not the movies, not the myths, and concluded that the berserker, as the world pictures him, never went berserk at all. He argued the word really meant something closer to champion. It made him deeply unpopular with everyone who loves the wild version of this story. In 2017, on the island of Kivaløy near Tromsø, a rescue excavation ahead of construction opened a Viking boat grave nobody had scheduled to find. A warrior, buried with his weapons inside a 5-meter hull, and underneath him, pressed into the dark soil, 5 curved claws, still locked in the shape of a paw, a bear paw, lay beneath a man like a coffin lining. It's the kind of detail Dale's own research says shouldn't matter, ritual, not rage. But it's also the kind of detail that keeps this argument from ever fully going away. Say the word berserker, and you already know the image. Foaming at the mouth, biting his shield, impossible to kill. Movies cast him. Metal bands name themselves after him. Almost none of that image comes from anyone who actually saw a Viking Age warrior fight. That is the first problem. The most vivid description of berserker rage, men mad as hounds or wolves, biting their shields, untouched by iron, comes from the Icelandic writer Snorri Sturluson in his saga collection Heimskringla. Snorri wrote that around 1225, the warriors he described belonged to the court of King Harald Fairhair in the late 800s. He was describing something that happened almost 400 years before he picked up a pen. He never saw it. He was retelling a legend that had already been retold for generations, reshaped by every storyteller who touched it along the way. The only account close to the actual Viking Age is a poem called Haraldskvæði, composed around the year 900 by a court poet named Thorbjorn Hornklofi. It is the oldest surviving use of the word berserkir, and the oldest use of Ulfhednar, wolf coats, warriors who fought wrapped in wolf skins instead of bear skins. But the poem is short, 2 verses. It calls them wolfskins, who bear bloody shields and sit together at the king's table. That is it, no frenzy, no foaming, no magic immunity. The wild howling version of the berserker did not come from the Viking Age. It came from a medieval Icelander, writing centuries later, and it got louder every time someone retold it. The word shows up elsewhere too, scattered through the sagas like a rumor that wouldn't die. In Egil's saga, the hero's grandfather, Kveldulf, is described in terms that echo shapeshifting and battle fury. In Volsunga saga, Sigmund and his son, Sinfjotli, pull on wolf pelts in the forest and supposedly turn savage, unable to speak, howling instead of talking. Vatnsdøla saga has its own berserker showdown. Every one of these stories was written down in Iceland, centuries after any of it could have happened, by Christian authors reconstructing a pagan world they never lived in. That doesn't make them worthless. It makes them evidence of what people believed about berserkers 2, 3, 400 years later, not evidence of what berserkers actually did. And the fear was real, even if the frenzy was embellished. By the time Iceland wrote down its laws in the Grægis Code, berserker rage had become a crime. If a man falls into a berserk frenzy, the penalty is lesser outlawry, and the same penalty applies to men who are present unless they restrain him. That's not folklore. That's a legal statute aimed at controlling something dangerous enough that lawmakers needed language for it. Grettis saga records a Norwegian jarl, Eiríkur Håkonarsson, outlawing berserkers outright around the year 1015. Whatever they were, by the 11th century, Norway wanted them gone, banned by name, written into law as a problem to be managed. So if the legend can't be trusted, the physical evidence has to carry the weight instead. And bear claws under a warrior aren't unique to that one boat on Kavaloy. They're part of something far older, a buried tradition stretching back 500 years before the Viking Age even began. That storage box from the opening, the one from 1889, belongs to a barrow at Evebo, in Gloppen, western Norway. It was opened by Gabriel Gustafsson, the same excavator who'd later dig up Norway's most famous Viking ship, the Oseberg. Inside a stone chamber sealed with birch bark, he found a man laid out on a bearskin, dressed in a red tunic with gilded clasps, wrapped in a tasseled cloak woven with dyed animal patterns. They called him the Master Warrior. He was buried in the late 400s, nearly 400 years before Harold Fairhair's court, and roughly 700 years before Snorri wrote a single word about berserkers. The barrow above him was originally 25 meters across. He wasn't alone. At Dosen, near Os, excavators found dark brown hairs pressed 2.5 meters across the floor of the grave, the outline of an entire bear skin, still visible after 1,500 years, with claws from a single paw resting where a hand might once have rested on the fur. At Krosshaug in Rogaland, they found a woman buried around 450 AD in one of the richest female graves of the migration period, laid out with a gilded fibula, a bronze bowl, and 4 bear claws. At Snartimo, another master warrior grave, 3 more claws sit beside one of the most elaborately decorated swords ever recovered from Iron Age Norway. At Haram in Sunmore, a cremated man researchers nicknamed a petty king was wrapped in skin along with 15 bear claws and a gold ring weighing nearly 600 grams. Smaller finds turn up again and again across the same stretch of coastline, at Vemestad, at Nedre Aure, at Vestre Skogsfjord, at Eik near Kristiansand, where 9 claws were folded into a metal urn alongside a man's cremated bones. None of these graves knew about each other. They spanned 3 centuries and hundreds of kilometers. And yet the same choice keeps repeating: bury the dead wrapped in the skin of the largest predator in the forest. Cross into Sweden, and the pattern gets denser, not weaker. At Valskarda, a cemetery of boat graves near Uppsala, one grave held a man and a boy cremated together with 5 bear claws laid among sheep, chicken, dog, and pike bones. A few generations earlier, another grave at the same site held 11 claws, enough, researchers say, to represent a genuine bear pelt laid into the boat, not a token offering. At Gamla Uppsala, inside a looted boat grave, archaeologists found claws placed deliberately in pairs, port and starboard, flanking a man buried with 2 whole dogs, a complete horse, 10 arrowheads, and a Thor's hammer amulet resting against his chest. And at Tuna, in Alsaki, 7 claws turned up still connected to each other in their original anatomical order, meaning archaeologists weren't looking at scattered trophies. They were looking at what was left of an actual paw, folded into the grave intact, buried alongside a broken sword and a horse bridle. Zoom out, and the numbers get more interesting, not less. Across 6 major cemeteries and nearly 2,000 excavated graves, bear claws show up in roughly 1 out of every 30 burials. At Vendel, the site that gave the whole era its name, the rate climbs to almost 8%. At Birka, Sweden's great Viking Age trading town, it drops to less than 1%. The ritual wasn't universal, it wasn't random either. Something about certain communities, certain families, certain generations made this specific gesture matter enough to repeat it, generation after generation, for half a millennium. Here's where the excitement should slow down. When the German researcher Oliver Grimm sat down and counted every confirmed bearskin burial in Norway and Sweden combined, the total came to 1515 graves, out of everything ever excavated across 2 countries and 5 centuries. Most of them dug up in the 1800s and the early 1900s, decades before modern forensic archaeology existed, using notes that are frustratingly vague by today's standards. Grimm's own conclusion is blunt. 15 graves is, in his words, statistically meaningless. One new find could rewrite the entire picture. That's not the sentence you want to hear if you're building a documentary around a warrior cult, but it's the sentence that keeps this story honest. And the theory that keeps pulling people back in is the drug theory. 1784, a Swedish theologian first proposed that berserkers fought under the influence of fly agaric, the red and white mushroom associated with hallucinations and pain suppression. More recently, an ethnobotanist named Karsten Fotter revived the idea in 2019, but pointed instead at henbane, a plant that can trigger rage, twitching, flushed skin, and a frightening loss of inhibition. It's a seductive explanation. It would mean the berserker wasn't a myth or a metaphor. He was a chemically altered soldier, deliberately poisoned into a state no enemy could reason with. For a while, that theory looked like it might have physical backing, because henbane has actually been found in a Viking Age grave at Fyrkat, inside Harald Bluetooth's ring fortress in Denmark. Archaeologists opened a grave and found a small purse of henbane seeds, an iron staff, a chair-shaped amulet, silver toe rings, real seeds, real analysis, real Viking Age burial. But read the rest of the report. That grave did not belong to a warrior. It belonged to a woman, almost certainly a Volva, a Norse seeress. The National Museum of Denmark states it plainly. The henbane came from the seeress's grave, not a soldier's. This wasn't proof of a battle drug. It was proof of a woman's ritual kit, a discovery about prophecy, not war. No confirmed drug residue has ever been found in a grave identified as a berserker's. The theory that made the story more exciting turned out to be borrowing evidence from somebody else's grave entirely. And there's a strange echo of that same pattern elsewhere. On the island of Åland, in Sweden, a woman was buried inside a stone ship, dressed, according to museum records, in bear fur, with sacrificed animals around her and an iron staff topped with a tiny house-shaped ornament. Bear symbolism again, but once more on a woman associated with ritual and prophecy, not a sword-carrying man on a battlefield. If bear imagery in Norse burial belong to any single group, the graves don't cooperate with the story we've been telling. Warriors, farmers, and seeresses were all doing something with bears and death, and archaeology hasn't sorted out whose meaning belonged to whom. Then the second reversal lands, and it's worse for the warrior cult theory than the first one. A research team at Uppsala University ran the numbers on hundreds of Swedish graves containing bear claws, over 400 in total, with roughly 250 datable. If the berserker theory were right, you'd expect those claws concentrated in rich weapon burials, elite fighters, warlords. That's not what the database showed. The claws were almost never turned into pendants or amulets, and the people buried with them were, overwhelmingly, ordinary farmers, herders, hunters. Not an elite brotherhood of killers, just people across centuries who wanted a bear beside them in death. That single study did something uncomfortable to the whole premise. It didn't destroy the connection between bears and Norse identity. That connection is real, and it's everywhere, from grave goods to a set of bronze plates found in Åland, Sweden in 1870 and dated to around 600 AD. One die shows a wolfskin warrior beside a horned, one-eyed figure believed to be Odin himself. Another die from the same set shows something researchers call a man between bears. Laboratory technicians later laser scanned the corroded, original Odin figure and confirmed what had long been suspected. The eye really is missing. These weren't decorations, they were used to stamp foil onto the helmets of actual warriors, the same style of helmet plate linked, through shared craftsmanship, to the ship burial at Sutton Hoo in England. It doesn't prove the wolf warrior on that helmet plate ever fought a real battle. But it means Iron Age Scandinavians were casting this figure in bronze and wearing him into war 3 centuries before Snorri ever wrote his name. Which brings the story to its real fight, not between archaeologists and grave robbers, but between archaeologists themselves. This is the fight Dale picked years before the Cavalli grave was even excavated. Neil Price, a Viking specialist at Uppsala University, has spent decades arguing that berserkers belong to a genuine Odinic warrior cult, shamanic figures tied to death, transformation, and the god who ruled both. He consulted on the 2022 film The Northman, and his version of the berserker is the one modern audiences have absorbed without ever knowing they were watching one side of an academic argument. Dale disagrees, and his argument is uncomfortable for anyone who loves the wild version of the myth. After a full review of the Old Norse sources, he concluded that berserkers do not go berserk at all. He argues the frenzy was calculated posturing, a ritual performance designed to intimidate, not madness, but theater. In his reading, the word berserker is closer to champion than maniac. Elite royal bodyguards seated at the king's table, just as Hornklofi's 9th century poem described, not chemically altered killing machines, howling through a battlefield. There's a second uncomfortable detail buried in the etymology, and it's one linguists still argue about. Snorri, the same writer who gave us the foaming mouth image, also floated the idea that berserker meant bare shirt, meaning the warriors fought without armor. That reading got picked up centuries later by the novelist Sir Walter Scott during the Romantic revival of Norse mythology in the early 1800s, and it helps cement the wild, half-naked warrior image that still dominates posters and video games today. Modern scholars, including the linguist Anatoly Liberman, mostly reject it, arguing bare shirt fits the actual Old Norse language far better. But part of the berserker's modern image was shaped not in the Viking Age, and not even in Snorri's medieval Iceland, but in 19th century Europe, by writers falling in love with the myth they were also busy inventing. The academic argument hasn't cooled down either. In 2023, a major 3-volume study called Bear and Human, gathering more than 60 different research papers, was published specifically to re-examine bear symbolism across Northern Europe, berserkers included. That's not old history being quietly settled in a footnote somewhere. That's an active, ongoing fight happening in real journals, right now, over what these graves actually mean. So who gets to decide what a berserker actually was? Every museum case holding a bear claw from Crosshog or Snartamo is quietly taking a position in that fight. Label it warrior grave, and you're endorsing a cult the statistics don't fully support. Label it farmer's grave, and you undercut one of the most marketable legends in Norse history. This is the industry we opened with. Sagas turned into tourism boards, museums that need a story people will pay to see. Viking heritage. Tourism brings hundreds of thousands of visitors through Norway and Sweden every year, and the berserker is one of its biggest draws. Action figures, saga tours, festival reenactors, howling in bear pelts for tourists with cameras. A skeptical academic paper doesn't sell tickets. A frenzied, drug-fueled super soldier does. That doesn't make Dale wrong, or Price wrong. It means the truth has to compete with a marketing machine that has every incentive to keep the wildest version alive, which is exactly why that grave on Kvaløy matters, and exactly why it doesn't prove what the title of this video promised you. Grimm himself calls it simply the most recent bearskin burial known in Norway or Sweden. One more data point in a 15 grave sample. He already warned us not to trust too far. But it is real. The claws were found in situ, still locked in the anatomical position of a living paw, resting beneath a dark stain in the soil that once was a bear's hide. Whoever placed that skin under that warrior, in a boat, on an island near Tromsø, around the year 800, was performing something, a belief, a status marker, possibly a fragment of the same tradition that put a bear skin under the Ivabo warrior 300 years earlier, and under the woman at Crosshog, and under the men at Valsgard and Gamla Uppsala in Sweden. Nobody drugged them. No lab has ever proven a warrior fought in a chemical trance. No saga written by someone who was actually there describes foam and fire immunity. Only a terse line about wolf skins sitting at a king's table. What survives instead is quieter, and in its own way, stranger, a buried habit repeated for 500 years across 2 countries of laying the dead to rest inside the skin of the most dangerous animal in the northern forest. So, does this grave finally prove the berserker was real? Not the way the legend tells it. Not foaming, not immune to iron, not drugged into madness. But the ritual behind him, the bear, the ceremony, the buried belief that a warrior needed something wild sewn into his afterlife, that part is no longer myth. That part is real, buried, and unmistakably intentional. The claws from Kvaloi sit today in storage, cataloged, numbered, waiting for the next test that might finally say more. Until then, they stay exactly where archaeology left them, curled in the dark, still shaped like the paw that once moved. The ritual was real. The rage may never have been. If you found that as unsettling as I did, subscribe. This channel digs up the graves history would rather leave sealed. And tell me what you think. Was the berserker a warrior or a performance the Vikings staged to win a war before it ever started?